In nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. Vieni Santo Spirito,
nel cuore dei tuoi fedeli e accendi in essi il fuoco del tuo amore.
Manda il tuo Spirito e ogni cosa sarà creata.
E rinnoverai la faccia della terra.
Preghiamo. O Padre, che nella luce dello Spirito Santo guidi il credente alla conoscenza piena della verità, donaci di gustare nel tuo Spirito la vera sapienza e di godere sempre del suo conforto. Per Cristo nostro Signore.
Amen.
Ave Maria, piena di grazia, il Signore è con te. Tu sei benedetta fra le donne e benedetto è il frutto del tuo seno, Gesù.
Santa Maria, Madre di Dio, prega per noi peccatori, adesso è l'ora della nostra morte. Amen.
Gloria al Padre, e al Figlio, e allo Spirito Santo.
Come nel principio, ora e sempre, nei secoli dei secoli. Amen.
Regina Apostolorum.
Ora per nobis.
Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Allora, prima di dare la parola a Alberto Garcia, ci farà la cortesia di presentare il professore Robert Hesse, che oggi ci farà questa conferenza, questa presentazione. Il nostro caro ospite, è la prima volta che viene da noi, e proprio Alberto è stato, diciamo, il mediatore che ci ha offerto questa possibilità, che abbiamo accolto volentieri. Per quelli che non capiscono l'inglese, perché la conferenza sarà in inglese e c'è la traduzione simultanea, ci sono le apparecchiature a disposizione. Vedo che la maggioranza non avrà bisogno di questo, per cui mi fa anche piacere che molti potranno seguirlo anche direttamente. A Bologna anche sarà ritrasmessa la traduzione con il sistema audio, per questo abbiamo dovuto sistemare un po' le cose, dunque speriamo che tutto vada al meglio. Io ringrazio da subito il professor Hesse di essere oggi con noi e adesso do la parola a Alberto che ci farà la cortesia di presentarlo. Grazie.
Salve, buonasera a tutti, sono il professor Alberto Garzia, direttore della cattedra UNESCO di Bioetica e Diritti Umani e ho l'onore di introdurre oggi il professore Robert Hesse. Cambio adesso nella lingua inglese. So I'm very happy to introduce you Professor Robert Hesse that I met for the first time last summer in Houston, Texas. And in reality, it was Father Joseph Tam that you know that for the first time met Robert Hesse in a conference, and he told me that, oh, maybe you can meet this guy when you will go to Houston. So I was reading some of the curriculum of Professor Robert Hesse, and it was strange. So he's a deacon, a lay deacon, and he's the vice chairman of an Institute for Spirituality and Health. And in the same business card, this contemplative network, interdenominational prayer, what is this? I'm involved in bioethics. I'm involved in bioethics and human rights as the director of the UNESCO chair in bioethics and human rights. And so we had a nice lunch in a very beautiful place in Houston discussing about our common interest, especially in the area of neuroscience. And as you probably know, the Institute of Science and Faith and the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights, we organized a group of study on neurobioethics. So we decided to, I would say, to invite Professor Hesse to come to Rome. Actually, he offered to come to Rome and then to give a lecture in the Master Science and Faith, and also we will have another meeting with the group in neurobioethics. Robert Hesse is an ordained Catholic deacon and co-founder and president of Contemplative Network, dedicated to interdenominational Christian contemplative prayer. He is an ex officio board member of CN and is a practicing contemplative in the Trappist Christian tradition. He was inspired at Gethsemane Trappist Monastery, at the time home to Trappist monk Thomas Merton. He was appointed by Trappist monk Thomas Keating, commissioned presenter, coordinator, Contemplative Outreach Limited, and emissary to the M&L Institute for Research on Contemplatives, in response to an invitation by the Dalai Lama to Keating. Professor Robert Hesse. Bob is vice chairman and faculty member, Institute for Spirituality and Health, which at 95 years is the oldest such organization in the U.S., located in the Texas Medical Center, the largest medical center in the world by multiple times. He is also an instructor, Rice University, and an adjunct professor, University of St. Thomas. He has served on the Deacon Spiritual and Community Life Committees of the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston. He has been retreat team member, Holy Name Retreat Center, founding advisor, the World Faith Connection speaker, Rothko Chapel, MD Anderson Cancer Center, St. Luke Hospital, and Bowen Center, and co-founder Faith Science Initiative at the University of St. Thomas. Interests include the convergence of science and religion, physics, metaphysics, chemistry, life, biology, consciousness, and psychology mysticism. He has a special interest in healing suffering from mental illness. He has given numerous presentations internationally. He holds a Bachelor in Theology from the University of St. Thomas, and a Bachelor in Chemistry and a PhD in Physical Chemistry from St. Louis University. He was president founder of Energy Consulting Company, HEI, having traveled to over 60 countries, often establishing international consortia. His last engagement was a project manager on the planning of 2 major energy projects in Israel. He is widowed with 2 children and 2 grandchildren. So I want to thank Professor Hesse to be with us today, and he will speak about consciousness and neurotheology.
Neurotheology.
Okay?
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Alvin. I appreciate that. We can never get enough prayer. So may I start with my own little prayer for this meeting. I'd like to say that we come here for God's greater glory, not ours, particularly not mine. So with that in mind, I ask that you all close your eyes, and we all close our eyes, and remind ourselves that we are not our thoughts, that we are deeper than our thoughts. We are asked to share in God's thoughts. We can only do that in silence. So for a moment here, let's rest in silence, thinking only of God as our thoughts come. Amen.
Okay.
That prayer seems appropriate for this subject. I'm sure that every one of us in one way or another has experienced the awe of God's creation, whether it's in a Milky Way stars or the mountains or a sunset. We've experienced God's grandeur and creation. But now we need to start exploring the grandeur of that creation in our brain, the very repository of all the other awes that we know. What a better place to look for the awe. And often our experience of God is in the unconscious mind. Scholars have been shedding some insight into the unconscious mind, but science still needs to look further in the unconscious and see how it interacts with the conscious mind. And yet, it is how much we don't know that really leads us to stop judging others and only to love. So let's start on this journey into the awe of our brain. Faithful souls in the 21st century have been reporting profound mystical experiences. Throughout the centuries, the same experiences. And the term mystical is often used to describe these experiences, which is synonymous with contemplative, and had its origins in the fact that the church was not sure what they were. It was a mystery. And so the word mystics arose. So it's not magic, it's the mystics. It's the mystery. And probably the giants of the church, doctors and saints, both Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, describe these experiences very well. And the people in the 21st century that experience these things, you'll find, don't talk about them very often, but they will be very similar to what the mystics throughout the centuries have spoken about, and particularly those two. Now, neuroscientists, through reason, are recognizing the reality and similarity between contemplative experiences and near-death experiences in their studies of the brain and consciousness. Some believe this field to be the most challenging and final frontier of science. Catholicism believes that God reveals himself to us through faith and nature, as affirmed by Blessed John Paul II in an encyclical where he said, there exist two realms of knowledge, one which has its source in revelation, faith, and one is reason or science, and both can be discovered, we can discover the power of God. And he gave further encouragement. He said, it is a duty for theologians to keep themselves regularly informed of scientific advances in order to examine, if such be necessary, whether or not there are reasons for taking them into account in their reflection or for introducing changes in their teaching. I hope I'm going at a nice pace for the translator. In accordance with and consistent with that Blessed John Paul II's thoughts in the encyclical, scientists are starting to grant degrees in the field of neurotheology. And there's some debate as to whether that is really a field that is ready for such a discussion. So the discussion today, what we're going to talk about are, and I'll give you a layout of the subjects we want to cover. First round, we're going to go through the background a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the brain, then the conscious mind, the unconscious, and then the mystical. Starting with the background, it's good to talk about what these definitions are, just so there's no confusion. Conscious is the quality or state of being aware of external object or something within oneself. Unconscious is the mind operating well outside the attention of the conscious mind, altered state of consciousness with limited conscious awareness. Good examples: conscious mind, you're solving a math problem. The unconscious mind, you're breathing. The term subconscious is not used in the scientific community. Layperson's replacement for the word unconscious. So it's kind of avoided in the academic and scientific settings. And so if you hear me slip and say subconscious, correct me. I'm not going to go through the details of the history of consciousness, but it's interesting to note that the first person to really write about it was Aquinas. Then Leibniz talked about unaware perceptions. These are just scientists that address the subject throughout the history. And I'm hitting just the highlights. I'm not going to go into the details here. Herbert, unconscious, conscious boundaries. And then Weber, German, not surprisingly, wants to get into the math and the psychophysics measurements, into the math of it. Mueller, perception versus objectivity. Cattell, talking about thoughts in time. Our perception of time is not consistent. And Freud, of course, unconscious motives. Now, there are certain scientific unknowns that I want to just address right up front. Science is searching for where consciousness is. And there's a big debate about it. They can't find it in the brain, and you're going to start to see some evidence that it may not just be in the brain. Science can't determine the difference between imagination and reality, and how the brain deals with that. And of course, the brain is not equal to the mind. It might be analogous to computer hardware versus software, but there's really no good definition of the two. Imagination versus reality. Perhaps this is mystically knowing by unknowing. But these are all conjectures. Science doesn't know any of these. Now, that was some background. Let's talk about the brain. The brain is a place where there is conflict. And one of the interesting things about the brain is that, and the challenge in the scientific world, is that you're trying to measure something objectively, and yet there are subjective experiences involved. This is the biggest challenge in the scientific community. How do you measure subjective experiences? Somebody may talk about an experience they have, but how do you measure that objectively? And to show you that how intellectually sound and deep I am, I got this saying off of a fortune cookie at a restaurant. And it was wonderful. And I immediately went back and I looked up who said this. And this captures it. If the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. And it captures that dilemma science has of objectivity versus subjectivity. Most of science studies objective matter and can measure. Let's talk about how big the brain is. Now, I've never seen this comparison done before, but we think of the universe as being huge, but we don't think about the brain as being huge. So I put these comparisons together because I thought it was rather interesting. The universe and the brain are very similar in many ways. 170 billion galaxies, give or take a few billion. And these numbers change. 100 billion cells in the brain, 400 plus billion stars per galaxy, 1 billion neurons or nerves in the brain. Total stars, just estimates, 10 to the 24th septillion. If you've ever used that word more than once in your life. 100,000 dendrites per neuron. 14 billion light years, 100 trillion dendrites. Now here is the interesting part. The visible universe that we just described, all those stars and all those galaxies, makes up only 4% of the universe. The other 96% is invisible dark energy and dark matter. The brain, 5% conscious, 95% unconscious. That, I'm going to back up just one for a second. Yeah, that could be on one form. Sorry, that's okay. That magnitude, it gives us a sense of what we're up against in science, in neuroscience, and neurotheology. There are those that believe that God speaks to us through the unconscious. This is a tremendous avenue for speaking and not knowing. And in the mystical world, you think of the unknowing as the way to know God. We know God through the unknowing. Most of the mystics write that way, as you know. When we think we know God, then we don't. And if we have an image of God and we hold on to it, we're in trouble. Because then we run the risk of making God in our image rather than allowing her to make us in her image. And as a person trained a little bit in engineering, we are blessed as engineers to look at the design of the brain. It's got redundancy. Fortunately, we only have one mouth. I think God was trying to tell us something. We should not be talking so much, we should be listening. But there are redundancies beyond that. Eyes, we have 2 eyes, we've got 2 ears, 2 arms, legs, 2 lungs, kidneys, etc., and 2 brains. 2 brains. Remember that mention I said about conflict? Keep that in your head. So we're going to talk about these 2 brains, and there are various aspects to the brain duality. There's the right and left hemispheres. There are the right and left hemispheres. There's the present and the future, multi-stable stimulus, emotion and reason, and conscious and unconscious. Now, I put these in red because as we go through the subjects, when you see the color come up, you'll know we're shifting to the next one. So let's talk about the right and left hemispheres. You've heard of people saying their right and left brain. Okay. There's truth to that. The right brain does the visual spatial perception, fact-checking, scientific observation. The left brain is language, organization, problem-solving, storytelling, theological constructs. Now, people are known to be right-brained or left-brained. But what happens when there's a disconnect? Epileptics suffer from a terrible illness, and quite often in science we learn things not from the normal, but from the abnormal. So in a desperate move to try to help epileptics, they did hemispherectomies. Now, they also did severed corpus callosum. Now, what does this mean? Well, the severed corpus callosum is the section that connects the right and left brain. There's a little section up top about this big that is the bridge for transferring information. Now, it is possible to actually sever that connection and have the person live a normal life. It is also possible to remove the total hemisphere of one side of the brain if it's done at a young enough age, less than 7 years old or very young, and still have the person in both of these procedures live a fairly normal life. We've got two brains. Now, it's rather interesting that self-awareness is a question when you have these procedures. So, for example, in the severed corpus callosum, if you tell the person verbally to pick up a pencil and you write down visually to pick up a piece of paper, the right hand will pick up the pencil, the left hand will pick up the piece of paper, and they won't know what the other is doing because there's no bridge. Now, I have to think about that if I got it right, but one hand does one and the other hand does the other because the verbal and the visual are coming in on different halves. So, there is some impairment of self-awareness. Who are you? Are you the guy picking up the pencil or the woman picking up the piece of paper? You can't remove the front and the back half. You die. It's only the right and left half. Now let's talk about present versus future as a part of the brain duality. There's such a thing as called the Ulysses contract. After the mythological character, Ulysses wanted to go in and hear the sirens, if you know the mythology. And he knew that if he heard the sirens, he would lose control, and he didn't want to be destroyed. So he made a pact with his shipmen, and they covered their ears, and they made a deal, and he said, if I tell you keep going, ignore me, turn around. Ulysses mythology. So it's really bound by the siren, bound from the sirens, and it's a negotiation with self, in a sense. It's a duality. And you need others to do this. Now you may think, well, that was Ulysses. What practical applications are those? Well, there are a number of Ulysses examples. There's adjustable rate mortgages, if you have heard of those. I can afford this house at 5%, and then a year from now or 2 years from now, suddenly you can't afford it. Sugar versus diet. Do I eat the sugar now, or do I maintain the future diet? Alcoholics, afraid that they will imbibe in the alcohol if it's in the house. So they negotiate with their self to remove the alcohol from the house. So later, at a future time, they don't take it. And in bioethics, which Friday will come, we're talking about advanced directives. When you may not mentally be capable of making a decision later, you are negotiating with two parts of the brain, present and future. It's brain duality. Now, multi-stable stimulus. You've all seen this kind of image where you look at it one way, it's a goblet, and the other way it's two faces. Most consider it impossible to see both simultaneously. People that think they see both simultaneously are switching like that. Optical illusions that where there are more than one image cause the mind to focus on one or the other, but not both. Now you may personally say, I think I can see both at the same time, but that's not what most people and most scientists believe. The next is emotion and reason. Now, I realize this is kind of a long list, but just to go through the flavor of it, I think we all know this, we've seen it before. Emotion is fast, reason slow. Emotion is automatic, reason systematic. Emotion is implicit, reason explicit. Emotion heuristic, in other words, you kind of know what's got to happen. You may not have figured it all out, but you kind of intrinsically know. And it's analytic in the reason sense. Emotion intuitive, reason rule-based. Emotion reactive, reason proactive. Emotion impulsive, reason reflective. Emotion is in the limbic system in the brain, reason is in the neocortex. The limbic is the oldest part of the brain. The neocortex, the youngest. So you've got this duality fight going on. But the interesting part about this is the unconscious and the conscious. So for the purpose of this talk, I'd like to focus on the unconscious and the conscious. Now, the conscious brain is for problem solving. I gave that example before. The unconscious is like breathing. David Eagleman, a neuroscientist in Houston, wrote a book that's a wonderful book if you get a chance, called one title.
Some?
No. It'll come to me. I've got it in my bag out there. Anyway, he wrote this wonderful book. And he used an example that I think captures it. And he called the conscious mind something like the chief or the executive officer of a company. And the unconscious mind, like the worker, is making widgets. Okay? And so the chief executive officer doesn't know how to make widgets. But if the widget machine breaks down, and by the way, the workers know how to make widgets, but if the widget machine breaks down, the workers come running to the CEO and say, we've got a problem. And then the CEO starts to look into it and try to figure out what's going on. Okay? So, this is a wonderful example of how the conscious-unconscious mind works. And there's this, when you have conflict, they both have to play. This is one of the key points of being human is having that conflict. I don't believe the mind is a dangerous place, but I thought there was a wonderful quote by I think he was a psychiatrist, Dadzens, quote, "The mind is a dangerous place, never go there alone." I always got a kick out of that. But it's back to this issue of you've got the conscious and the unconscious, and what are you going to do? Now, the belief is that because we work well with this conflict, we always have several systems coming up through the brain telling us something, and when that conflict arises, our CEO is called in to resolve it. And computers, they thought they were going to have expert systems, fuzzy logic, or artificial intelligence, which had sub-programming, and all of these are built up from bottom up, but they're not based on conflict. And so some neuroscientists believe that's why computer failures have taken place. Roger Penrose, the assistant to Hawking, wrote a wonderful book, and that was The Emperor's New Mind. And if you read that book, he gets into computer language, which is, in mathematics, we're the base 10 system. In computer language, you're base 2. Either electricity's on or off. So if you read his book, several pages into it, you're going 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, and after a few pages of that, you can lose it. But his conclusion was that you cannot create a computer program to replicate the mind. It's impossible. So An example of this conflict is something that I experienced when I was on a ship in the Great Barrier Reef. And I knew I was susceptible to seasickness. And so they fortunately came out with the patch by the ear, which is a narcotic that just drugs the inner ear. If I didn't have that, the inner ear, the visual says, you're moving with the ship. Everything seems okay. Your eyes follow the ship. Your inner ear says, something's not right. And so the conflict causes you to rise to the CEO level, and you say, either I have to go up overboard and throw up, or lay down, or do something, or close my eyes. I got to do something that's not right. Okay? It's an example of this conflict. And so you drug the inner ear, so there's no longer a conflict. So now let's talk about the conscious mind. Now, I talked about conflict being at the heart of this issue. It drives decisions to the conscious mind when there is a conflict. And so the conscious mind is extremely important. And an example of, it's one of the things that makes us human, but animals have conscious minds too. And there's an interesting test of whether an animal has a conscious mind. And it was done on a rat. They put the cheese out there, and they electrify the cheese. So a rat goes, bites into the cheese, gets shocked, backs off, and then he gets into a rocking mode. And then he becomes catatonic and freezes. He has no conscious mind. He has no CEO to make the decision which is better, to eat and live or eat and die. Eat and live and eat to die. Either way, if I don't eat, I die. If I eat, I die. I mean, that's really the dilemma. Okay. And so that scientists believe that's one way of measuring whether there's a conscious mind in the animal. And I didn't quite word that properly. The confusion is, do I not eat and die, or do I not eat and die? Or do I eat and die? Okay, either way, I die, and they got survival. Okay. Now, the brain operates on electromagnetic energy, which is like light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And our brains operate on various wavelengths, and these brain waves of delta, theta, alpha, and beta are the ones that you hear scientists talk about. Now, there are certain things that are associated with each. So delta would be somebody in a coma. Theta, somebody sleeping. Alpha, somebody in contemplative prayer. And beta, full-fledged work. Now, this is not fixed. There are some long-term practitioners of contemplative practice or meditation that will get to the delta level. And quite often in sleep, and we're going to get into sleep, you're coming between these. So the sleep pattern can enter into your prayer practice. So let's talk about the stages of sleep. We've all fallen asleep during prayer. But that may not all be that bad. You just don't want to go too deep. Now, the beginning of sleep is the alpha waves. Get sensations, then there's drowsiness and theta. And these are rough time frames. Rhythmic waves, 20 minutes roughly. And then transitional delta into deep sleep. And there's a recycle between 2 and 3 in the sleep patterns. And then deep delta sleep for 30 minutes, and then rapid eye movement or dreaming after 90 minutes. So you're dancing in all these wavelengths in sleep. Now, the conscious states that scientists will talk about are wakefulness, where you're not sleeping, REM sleep, and non-REM sleep. So if you go back to that list, those are three kind of basic stages of consciousness. There are scientists that believe that near-death and contemplative experiences may be between wakefulness and REM. Now, it's not unusual in our spiritual writings to have spiritual writers write about God speaking to them in their dreams. And there's some scientific evidence that that might actually be taking place. Now, I personally practice century prayer, which is a form of a Trappist thought tradition. There's a Benedictine tradition of worldwide community of Christian meditators. Collective contemplative outreach is what I've kind of come through. But in the middle of the night, as I get older, and maybe some of you have experienced this, there's a period in the middle of the night where you're going through a rumination of thought, and you can't get back to sleep. And that rumination of that thought pattern keeps you awake because you're analyzing, you're fully awake, you're trying to problem solve, which is not conducive to sleep. And my personal experience has been if I practice prayer and I don't do it to get anything out of it, that's not why you do it. You don't do it to get anything out of it. All you do is you do it to be closer to God. And in the process of being closer to God, I want to be with His thoughts, not mine, because I am not my thoughts. And as I focus back on God, I have found inevitably I fall asleep. Now, I don't do it to fall asleep because I'm not in control. I'm not trying to put myself in control. Quite often, the next morning, I have the best sleep I've ever had. When I wake up, tremendous amount of peace. And people who practice this prayer talk about peacefulness as one of the gifts of the Spirit. So let's talk about the unconscious. The unconscious is really the holy grail of science. Science knows very little about it. And yet I think it's God's vehicle from God's vehicle to us, because it is so unknown. If you've heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in physics, where a fundamental aspect of nature is that we cannot know nature completely. Scientists believe this now is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where you can't know both the electron's location and its momentum in any direction at the same time. Not because we can't measure it, because in the process of measuring it, we change it. It's actually a fundamental aspect of nature. So scientists, some decades ago, thought that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And they had to eat crow. I don't know how you translate that. They had to eat their words, because now they believe in Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Personally, I believe there is a similar uncertainty principle in the unconscious world, and you're going to kind of get a flavor for that as we go through it. Augustine, I cannot grasp all that I am. In a sense, he was talking about the unconscious. Perhaps you could say he was the first to talk about it, even before Aquinas. There's another quote from Augustine that I don't have in front of me, but I'll paraphrase it as best I can. Basically, a miracle is not suspension of the laws of nature. It's actually our inability to know the laws of nature completely. Wow. Wow. Suddenly then, miracle isn't the exception to the rule of creation. It's creation itself. Creation itself. And when something happens that we can't explain, it's just that we don't have the big picture. Let's talk about unconscious learning. I thought you would like the chicken sexers example, okay, and the plane spotters. In the chicken industry, when chicks are born, and I hate to say this, gentlemen, but the males are not of very much use. And so, from the economics of producing eggs, they destroy the male chickens. Now, this may not, we can get into an ethics course someplace else. And so the sooner you get them out of the food chain, the quicker you make money off the eggs. And if you've ever looked at a little chick, I defy you to tell me whether it's a male or a female. But some Japanese somehow were doing it. And so I think there were American chicken sexers. These are people that determine sex of chickens. This is a word that I don't know if it's going to be translated. So they went over to Japan to understudy these Japanese experts. And they said, how do you do it? And their answer was, we don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You're separating them right there in front of us. Yeah, but we don't know how we're doing it. Well, this is insane. Well, okay, we'll do it with you for a while. Okay. So they learned how to do it. They came back. They asked, everybody asked them, how you doing it? We don't know. We just do it. During World War II, there was a group of Englishmen near the coast that could, by sound, tell whether it was German planes coming in or whether it was the returning English planes from a bombing run. They couldn't tell you how they were doing it. They just knew. So there is the ability to learn in the unconscious. How am I doing, Tom?
You have 20 minutes.
There's the ability to learn in the unconscious. Anybody play a sport like tennis? How many play tennis? Okay, I've got a secret that you can use to beat any player. Okay, here it is. Before the game, you ask the tennis player who you know is better than you. You say to that tennis player, say, how do you know whether to hit the ball forehanded or backhanded? And the opponent starts to draw from his unconscious to his conscious mind to try to explain it to you. Then you play the game. And now it's in his conscious mind, and it's going so slow that you beat him. A little poem that I wish were translatable with rhyme, but we'll try it anyway. The centipede syndrome captures this. A centipede was happy quite, until a frog in fun said, pray tell which leg comes after which. This raised her mind to such a pitch, she lay distracted in the ditch, not knowing how to run. That captures the conflict of needing both conscious and unconscious, and how important unconscious is. Kevin Nelson, MD, wrote a book, The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, and he said, consciousness will never fully understand itself unconsciousness, no matter how much we peek inside the brain. This gets back to that Heisenberg uncertainty principle for the brain, I think, my opinion. Although I've never heard it put that way, I think that's what it is. Near-death categories. There have been studies on near-death experiences, and these are similar to mystical experiences, which we'll get into. And that's rather interesting. They are very similar. There's a cognitive issue of timelessness, an affective issue of peace, paranormal, out-of-body experience, and transcendental, angels or divine, that people will experience in near-death experiences. Scientific studies have been done, and there is a similarity between near-death and contemplative experiences. Now, I talked about near-death as if it were a unconscious issue. Now let's talk about the mystical. The brain seems to be wired for faith. Newberg, in his book, How God Changes the Brain, he's a neuroscientist, talked about that concept. And the issue is that there's so much data flowing into the brain, a huge amount of data, that our conscious mind cannot handle it. It's too slow. So you start to build a worldview in your unconscious mind through unconscious learning, like the chicken sexers, so that all the data that's flowing in, you can make some sense of it. So it's no surprise that if you grew up in Tibet or Italy, you're influenced, your unconscious is influenced, and your worldview becomes Buddhist if you're in Tibet and Catholic in Italy. But if there's any issue, it always can be raised to the conscious level. So our senses take 5% of the credit, our unconscious is there. And that's where I believe God speaks to us. It should be unconscious. Now, I'm going to just highlight this slide as a good example. There have been studies on the images of God, and we touched on the images of God and how we can't hold on to an image. The spiritual writers tell us we've got to constantly change images because it's through that unknowing that we know. And it's interesting how disparate the different images of God are. Distant, authoritarian, atheist, critical, benevolent. Again, based on your growing up and your unconscious worldview being developed unconsciously. Mystical synchronicity. Now, psychiatrists have known for some time that there is a mystical aspect to the brain. And Carl Jung talked about synchronicity. Two or more related events occur, and they seem to be by chance. There's no causality. And you've had this experience in your lives, I'm sure. You're praying about something and something shows up. And you go, he called it synchronicity. This is the God in the unconscious. The arguments against it are confirmation bias. The mind ignores data contrary to preconceived ideas. Now, I'll just touch on confirmation bias. That's a scientific term that basically is an affirmation of original sin. And I think original sin is a misnomer, frankly. Confirmation bias says that we are all prejudiced in choosing only the data that supports our preconceived ideas. So the challenge is to go deeper into a contemplative state so that you're opening yourselves up to other thoughts and other ideas from God, rather than relying just on your confirmation bias and bringing it to the conscious level in your analysis, which is one of the big challenges in bioethics we'll talk about on Friday. William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. Our present consciousness is only one of many worlds of consciousness that exist, which worlds must contain experiences which have a meaning for our life also. So he gave attributes of mystical experiences as language is inadequate, non-conceptual knowledge is involved, its brief duration, and its non-volitional passivity. In other words, you don't will it to happen. It happens and you're passive at the time. And so he was groping at this issue of mystical experience. And we're moving forward in time, of different people from different fields. You've got Max Planck, who won the Nobel Prize for quantum theory, not a psychiatrist. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. This is the man, Roger Penrose, in Emperor's New Mind I was talking about, who was assistant to Hawking. Consciousness seems to me to be such an important phenomenon that I simply cannot believe that it is something just accidentally conjured up by a complicated computation. It is the phenomenon whereby the universe's very existence is made known. One can argue that a universe governed by laws that do not allow consciousness is no universe at all. Think about the anthropic principle in the universe. That's it. And this man, who just wrote The Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon, and you'll find neurosurgeons and neuroscientists quite often are on different wavelengths. And he was infected by it's one of the top bestsellers right now. In fact, he's giving a talk tomorrow in Houston that I was going to go to. So I've got some other people that are going to report back. We wanted to ask him some interesting questions. But he was infected by E. coli infection, and he, being a neurosurgeon, he knew that that shuts the brain down completely. There were no explanations for a near-death experience with an E. coli infection. You can conjure up all the explanations you want. And in the appendix of his book, he goes through the scientific explanations people will raise to explain near-death experiences. And he said, couldn't be that, couldn't be that, couldn't be that. Here's what he says. He changed his worldview after he came out of it. He was one of the few, less than 2% survivors. That the brain itself doesn't produce consciousness, that it is instead a kind of reducing valve or filter, sifting the larger non-physical consciousness that we possess in the non-physical world down into a more limited capacity for the duration of our mortal lives. He's saying there's something beyond. Now, I'm not going to get into this slide. I think we're running out of time, but a neurotheologian would talk about various parts of the brain that would be dedicated to various religious experiences. I'm not talking about mystical here. These are the conscious level, most of them. And not surprisingly, the amygdala plays a big role, because that's pretty old in the brain. And so I'm not going to go through all of these. This will be in a handout, I take it, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Now, Newberg did a study of Franciscan nuns that were practicing centering prayer and did MRI scans and showed that the parietal lobes were bigger. Now, there are other scans that have been showing that the frontal lobes are bigger. And it's quite, scientists pretty well know that the moral decision-making is in the frontal lobes. And we'll get on that subject Friday more. But clearly, this concept of, this Catholic concept, it's not just Catholicism, but it's non-dualism. We are non-dual. The spirit and the flesh are interstitial. You cannot experience God without having somehow both involved. And this concept that prayer grows the brain. When scientists used to think the brain didn't grow, now they know it's got neuroplasticity. They made the same mistake with the brain that they did with that Einstein did with the universe. He didn't think the universe was expanding. So we're entering this new world. And the issue of prayer and how it can contribute to this mystical experience. Normally we talk about two different types of prayer. Discursive, which is cataphatic, goal-oriented, non-goal-oriented. There have been studies on this subject, by Templin Foundation on discursive prayer. No conclusion. I don't think they'll find one. God's in charge, okay? Contemplative prayer is apophatic, which is you have intention to be with God, you have consent to whatever God does, and you're gently letting go of your thoughts and returning to a symbol of your desire to be with God. It's nonverbal. Now, I've not seen this done before, but you'll know that when you go into chant in a prayer, and the chant is rhythmic, or you're using a Tibetan singing bowl and it's rhythmic, a lot of times music is rhythmic, but why does it touch us? The normal heart rate is 60 to 100 beats per minute. You know, average music is 80 to 100. I have a Tibetan singing bowl, and I measured it. You can hear the vibrations. It's 83. It's not by accident that these are all near the human heartbeat. It's rhythmic. Next one. So psychological effects of this prayer practice that I'm talking about can be the gifts of the Holy Spirit and tend to be fairly common. People will report these quite often. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but the most common is a sense of peace. Okay? Now, there are mystical characteristics that are similar to near-death experiences. Remember, we talked about near-death experiences when we're in the brain. Now we're talking about mystical experiences, and you'll see they're very similar. The sense of oneness with the omnipresent God in the universe, timelessness. Prayer seems shorter than it really is. You think it feels like 5 minutes, and it was 30, if you're going deep. Spacelessness, you don't feel sometimes your extremities, and I've seen this happen. Ecstasy, out of body. I'm not suggesting levitation. I'm suggesting that quite often the saints that talked about it had people who were writing for them, and they didn't know what other word to use, but it was a form of ecstasy. And a wholeness or perfection. So, did I hit the time limit?
Yeah.
Perfect. Very good.
Some minutes for questions and answers.
I'd like to ask a question. Have you dealt with this kind of subject before here very much, or?
First of all, thank you very much for the lecture. And I always wonder.
Could you come to raise your question through the microphone for the simultaneous translation?
Yeah, my question is basically about the deja vu experiences. I don't know if there is any explanation for that, like something that we see before and after happens afterwards. You can say something about it?
I can't address the research on that, but it has been discussed, and it's a little bit like synchronicity, only with the time warp. And so it's been acknowledged, but not studied. And again, the struggle in the study is being objective as a scientist when you're studying subjective experience. But as a person of faith, I believe that the vehicle is the unconscious that God is using to teach us.
Thanks very much for the talk. I got just a question about, is there any case that this is registered that this experience, especially mystical experience, are registered in other religions sometimes? So I don't know, I think especially in religions in Asia, which have this kind of particular mystic way. Today in today's world is very, very present.
Excellent question, and very common question. And the answer is yes. As a Catholic, and I think I see most Catholics here, I do a lot of interfaith dialogue, so I got to check it out to be fair. Believe that the Holy Spirit dwells within everyone, regardless of their faith belief. And so the Holy Spirit acts in them too. Now, just because their worldview is different, doesn't mean that the Holy Spirit can't work in them. And that's okay. I think I like to let God in charge once in a while. We don't have to figure it all out. Okay. But they experience very similar things. They have brains and they have the Spirit within. And that's wonderful when we can talk about this in a scientific way at a Buddhist scientific conference, which I've attended, and talk about these things. And people are normally afraid to talk about these things. But people who have been inspired into religious life quite often have these experiences, and it drives them. It drives them.
Thank you very much. I wanted to make a question, ask a question about how in the scientific world today this is received, because I know that there's still a lot of resistance to the idea of there being an immaterial self. A lot of scientists seemingly aren't willing to admit that there's an immaterial principle behind consciousness. They're trying to explain it in terms of the brain, or they just write it off as a mystery, an unexplainable mystery. But I'd be interested to know how your work is received as well from other scientists. That would be interesting. Thanks.
Perfect question. Unfortunately, I don't speak British English, so this is often a little bit of a different study pattern. But at the Institute of Spirituality and Health, we did a study of thousands of doctors in the medical community. And in the medical community where the doctors are in touch with patients in a personal way, over 85% believe in God and want to pray with their patients. And their patients want them to pray for them, but both of them are afraid. But it's being overcome. Now, studies of scientists that don't leave the lab and just have the tubes and don't have a life, don't have a personal relationship with people, the percentage of those that believe in God is much lower. I've seen studies of 20, 30%. So to answer your question, there's less reluctance now. So for example, as part of the Institute, and we don't have that problem in the Institute, we're interfaith. Our past president was a Jewish rabbi. Our chairman was a Jewish rabbi. The one before that was one or two before that was a Buddhist. And we're promoting research, okay? So I took the initiative to negotiate with David Eagleman, who wrote his book, Incognito. That was the name of the book, Incognito. Read it, it's wonderful. You'll see a lot of stuff I talked about in there. Mm-hmm. He is a neuroscientist, young man, sharp as a tack. Mm-hmm. And he's responsible for the fMRI facilities, functional magnetic resonance imaging facilities, at the Baylor College of Medicine. Now that's, I think, the second largest set of facilities in the world. And the first study that we're doing under this contract is discursive prayer one-on-one, because there was a medical doctor who saw results. And so he's going through and results in people who had suffered from depression. And so he's praying with them in a certain way, and they're asking questions of them during fMRI. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, is like a snapshot, a photo. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is like a movie. So you're asking them questions while they're being scanned, and the brain is changing. So my own personal goal is, that was the first one we're doing. Now I want to do the contemplative. That's really what my interests are. Okay. And there have been studies on that quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So here, some of the brothers in licensed in philosophy, we did a course called Anima Corporal, or Soul and Body. We talked a lot about the mind and the brain and the relationship. And basically we arrived to quantum theory, and how the quantum theory can measure, not so much in a scientific way, but use a kind of a probabilistic method to describe what happens just in simple reaction time of someone getting thrown an object, and all the synapses passing from neuron to action to all those connections, and how you can't really describe that scientifically, even how many reactions or synapses happen from the brain to the hand. So our professor was basically coming to the conclusion that you need another method besides completely scientific method to describe that, what happened. So that was a class we had, so that's what we've sort of been doing, and that's why I came today to follow up on that class. And then possibly just for, you can make your own comment on that, but then what would happen, I think you touched on just now discursive prayer, what happens in the mind when you're focusing on a gospel passage, when you're making a picture, when you're making it visual for yourself and depicting this scene, and not so much maybe the centering type of prayer, but maybe more type of prayer. Thank you.
Two issues. One, help me remember these. Okay. The first one was on the subject of probability theory in a sense. And science likes to have absolute answers. So it likes to have deductive reasoning. And but it got to the point, particularly with quantum mechanics, that wasn't going to work anymore. We had to deal with probability or inductive reasoning. And so I always think it's rather interesting, analogous to proving the existence of God. We can't prove the existence of God deductively. But inductively, you could make an argument. But ultimately, it would be it's easier to prove something inductively than deductively, that something exists. But that still doesn't mean you can prove it. Now, the idea of the of probability, that's a valid scientific basis for studying. And right, the synapses happen very quickly. We don't know everything. And so to come up with a probability theory on that would be scientifically acceptable. I don't know if I've answered your question. Now, the second issue was...
the visual type of prayer.
Oh, yeah, discursive. And, yeah, there have been studies on discursive prayer, but unfortunately, the Templeton Foundation grants were studying discursive prayer double-blind, praying for somebody they didn't know. And the reason I had problems with that a little bit, and I'm going to get to the meditation side too. The reason I have problems with that is it puts us into the position of playing God. Cure this person of cancer, please. Well, maybe that's not the best thing. And so the results are mixed. Did nothing turn out from that. Now, as far as meditation is concerned, they've studied two types of meditation. One where you engage your imagination in the Ignatian way of walking in the sand with Jesus and the sand coming between your toes and you're walking. And that's wonderful. And meditators have two different forms. The engagement of the imagination, and the other is a concentrative form of letting go of your own thoughts. Both are wonderful, both are valid. But even in Ignatian spirituality, correct me if I'm wrong, if I have a Jesuit here, you know, they ultimately get past that and they go into the concentrative let going of their thoughts. It's just that they go through the other stages first, and that's wonderful. I kind of like the Trappists. They kind of throw you in, okay. You want to swim, just throw them in. You find out. So they're both valid, and they've both been studied. They both have a neuroplastic effect on the brain.
Last question.
Thank you. I imagine that in your field, definitions become very important at this level. And I think one of the most important definitions is the definition of prayer that you would have. And in prayer, I can see that you would have perhaps two different definitions, one for conscious prayer and one for unconscious prayer. If I understand but from your presentation, conscious prayer would be more a deliberation process from the reasoning of the intellect, and unconscious would be more either an actual grace, what the Catechism calls, or a habit, which is that is gathered by, formed by the intellect from many acts done, and which is recalled by the memory and through the imagination.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. If you look at the spiritual writers and how they define prayer, it's very interesting. They have definitions all over the map. So I'll give you my preferred one, and I get it more from the Trappist tradition, and that is prayer is relationship with God, which is more encompassing than either of those. Both of those can fit within that definition. And I teach centering prayer to multi-different denominations. I taught it to the Orthodox, Episcopal, Quaker, Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, etc. congregations. And in the silence, there's no dogma. And so there's a hunger. And so when I'm teaching this, I give a demonstration of an interpersonal relationship with another human being, and how at first just an introduction, just kind of a general introduction. And I won't go through all the stages here, but ultimately it's a hug, because no words are necessary anymore. You know that person so well. And so what we're talking about in prayer as relationship is to head toward the divine hug, or the first line of the Song of Solomon, the mouth-to-mouth kiss of God.
I have also a question for you, Robert. I'm not sure if you have heard about what is called the God's helmet. 3 years ago, it was a kind of neuroscientists claimed that through a specific helmet, stimulating certain areas of the brain, he could provoke some experiences, mystical experiences. Do you think that these are mystical experiences? Have you read something about the God's helmet experiment?
I don't know it by that name, but there have been attempts to control things as if we're God. To me, that's not what it's about. But those attempts have included drugs. I mean, the Indians and the shamans use drugs. There have been electrically, I don't know about that particular one, but I read about electrically induced out-of-body experiences. But what's interesting is none of those in the literature do the people relate those experiences as being mystically religious, which is rather interesting. So my answer is, we're not in control here. And if we try to put ourselves in control, then we don't have the right relationship with our God.
So thank you very much, Professor Robert Hesse, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to meet you and to have these reflections on the topic you were dealing with.
It's an honor. Thank you.
Bene, già Alberto ci ha fatto la cortesia di ringraziare, anch'io ringrazio a nome personale, a nome di tutti, questa conferenza. Speriamo di avere l'opportunità di ritrovarci e continuare con questi argomenti. Ci sarà, come ha detto Alberto, questo altro incontro venerdì prossimo. E ci tratterà il tema della coscienza, la coscienza e la consapevolezza. E è in aula tesi qua sotto, mi sembra. Alle 17. Ok, dunque quelli che sono interessati potranno anche partecipare a questo nuovo incontro. Possiamo concludere come abbiamo cominciato con una preghiera. Nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. Ti rendiamo grazie per tutti i tuoi benefici, o Dio Onnipotente, che vivi e regni nei secoli dei secoli.
Amen.
Regina Apostolorum. Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo. Amen. Grazie. Thank you very much.